Hi, everyone, and welcome to our live National Quilter Circle event for the month of June. If you tuned in last month and are joining us again, welcome back, and we appreciate you tuning back in. If you're new, this is your first time joining us, what we're going to be doing is answering your quilting questions live for the next hour. Both questions that were submitted beforehand as well as ones that you guys submit live during the next hour. My name is Ashley, and I'm going to serve as the moderator, and I'm asking questions to the wonderfully talented and lovely Heather Thomas. So, Heather, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And so we're going to get right into it. We have a bunch of questions that were submitted beforehand, and so we'll get right to them. And the first question comes from Marietta, and she says, what is the trick in cutting the material to the correct size the pattern calls for? No matter what I do, some are right and some are off just a tiny bit, so everything is off when you sew them together.
Well, if they're only off a tiny bit, then it shouldn't matter. But if they're off a whole lot, that's when we have a problem. You want to make sure that you're cutting at least 2 layers of fabric at a time, preferably 4 layers. Make sure that your rotary cutter is very, very sharp, and make sure that you're holding your ruler correctly. One of the best ways to hold your ruler is so that your pinky finger comes off of the far edge of the ruler, the edge that you're not cutting off of, and actually makes contact with the ruler and the fabric at the same time, and that will give you a much steadier holding hand with that ruler. Also make sure that the edge of the rotary cutter has contact with the edge of the ruler the whole time you're making your cut. Often we swing that ruler in and then we swing it away from the ruler again at the beginning and the end of our cut instead of keeping that the cutter, not the ruler. The cutter, we swing it into the ruler and then swing it away from the ruler at the beginning and end of the cuts, and then we have, you know, kind of wonky shaped units. We need to make sure that that ruler and that cutter are flush to each other during the entire cut. One of the things I suggest is that you practice with some cheap muslin. Go quickly, but not so quickly that you're making mistakes. If you cut too slowly, you'll also end up with misshaped shapes also. It just takes a lot of practice to become a really good rotary cutter. So be patient with yourself too.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here is from Jan, and she says, when and how is binding added to a quilt?
Binding comes on last. It's the very last thing you do, and you do it after your quilt has been squared up or trimmed up as needed. Some people will stitch all the way around the outside surface of their quilt first before adding the binding. It would take the whole hour to teach you how to put the binding on, so what I'm going to suggest is that you find a good book or a tutorial on double French binding. That's the binding all of us use, but most people don't know that's what it's called. It's called a double French binding. And once you learn to put that on properly, you'll be able to bind anything. One of my tricks in making sure that that binding makes the edge tight and even and nice and doesn't have any rippling is that I pull that binding ever so slightly and keep it somewhat taut as I'm stitching it on the front of the quilt by machine, and then I hand stitch it to the back of the quilt. So a good tutorial on double French binding, and again, this takes practice. So you're going to want to practice on a couple of little junky little quilted pieces or quilted fabrics first, and then throw it on your first quilt.
Well, speaking of tutorials and things like that, we have a question here from Deborah, and she says that she has only just started machine sewing and quilting, and her question is, where can she find something out there for extreme beginners? She says she's looked everywhere, bought a few quilting books, but they are for people who have already done at least a little bit of quilting, and she finds them confusing. So do you have any suggestions for her?
My answer for that one would be anything from Alex Anderson. She's an author, and she's put out some great beginner books. And she actually speaks to you as she's writing in a language that isn't quilt talk. So you don't need to know all of the special quilting terms that might be confusing you as you're reading some of these other books. She's one of the best instructors that I know for beginners. So I would look for her books. She has one on doing very simple square quilts. So Alex Anderson books are great for beginners, and that's where I would start.
Perfect. Again, I want to remind anyone who's maybe just tuning in that you can ask questions to us live during the next hour by putting in the comment section below this video. And also, we have kind of a fun giveaway going on right now. We're giving away an Aliso Smart Iron to one lucky National Quilter Circle fan. So be sure to enter for that by clicking the banner below the video on this page. You can do that at any time. But also, while you're there, go ahead and submit some questions if you have them. So we do have a question that just came in, and Irene wants to know, she says she's taken an interest in paper piecing and would like to know more about it. What are some tips you can give her?
Well, paper piecing has come a long way since I first started, and there's lots of different ways of doing paper piecing. Some of the techniques that are out now, you don't even stitch through the paper anymore. All I know is that regardless of what technique you're doing or what methodology you're following with paper piecing, is don't get confused and buy into the idea that it's faster. It's not faster, it's just more accurate. The reason why we paper piece is because it allows us to do things, some piecing that has big long angles or strange ways of putting units together that would be very, very difficult if we didn't have that paper foundation. So the most important thing that I tell everybody when they're paper piecing for the first time is that everything feels backwards, and that's normal. So when you're doing it for the first time, if you're saying to yourself, my gosh, this feels just so backwards, you're right, it is backwards. We're sort of doing things backwards when we paper piece. Just follow the person's instructions, relax while you do it, and things will turn out. But again, this is something that you could take a class on. There's probably some videos on our website, but paper piecing is for accuracy, not for speed, and it feels backwards. So kind of get comfortable with that idea.
And I will just second that there are videos on our site. I believe you've even done a couple on paper piecing, so if you want to check some of those out, we do have those. Our next question here comes from Joanne. She says that she's been collecting some silk and velvet fabrics to assemble into a Victorian crazy quilt, and she wants to know if she can use a sew and flip method on a foundation fabric to construct this quilt.
Exactly. That's how most crazy quilts were made. Even back in the day when they were at their heyday, what most women did is they started with a muslin foundation, and they began by laying down their first piece, and then the second piece was laid down on top of the first, and then it was stitched through that muslin foundation and then flipped and pressed, usually with a finger press. And you can do it with a finger pressing or with an iron, but that's exactly how most crazy quilts are done. Of course, the muslin foundation is left in, and it actually gives great stability to some of those weaker fabrics and some of those stretchier kind of movie shimmy fabrics like the velvets. So yeah, you're right on track. Muslin foundation is exactly what you want, and the flip and sew technique is exactly what you want to use.
Perfect. All right, we've got some new questions coming in, so we'll get to a couple of those real quick. Lorna asks, I like to frame my small art quilts. Should I frame them behind glass? What should I do to protect them if I don't frame them?
Okay, well, absolutely not behind glass. If you've ever talked to or been to a museum that has quilts, they do not put them behind glass. At most, they'll put a piece of plexiglass or glass that hangs freely in front of them to protect them from air and dirt and things like that. The problem with putting anything behind glass is that there's always something on the surface of that quilt, even after it's been laundered. There's the skin cells from us as we walk through the house, dust, dirt, and any of those things put behind glass is going to cause that fabric to break down. So definitely do not want to put it behind glass. Instead, you simply want to take good care of it and keep it clean. Keeping it clean is very important, and the best way to keep an art quilt clean is to vacuum it. So buy yourself a piece of thin screen, like window screening, and you're going to set that on the quilt and then use the handheld portion of your vacuum either with or without the brush portion on the vacuum, and simply vacuum the surface of the quilt. That will keep it clean. Other than that, keep it out of the sun, and that's about all you can do. When it comes to keeping fabric-made items safe from the life they're going to live, unfortunately, we can only do so much. Sun is going to do a lot of damage to a lot of fabric, so keep it out of the sun. A lot of people will put some sort of a spray sun protector on it, which you can do, but it could harm the fabric in the long run too. We're not sure yet. And the other thing you can do, which will drastically change the surface of the quilt, is put a clear coat on top of the fabric. I do that often because I paint my fabric so much, and what I use is simply a product called Matte Medium. But it's going to make the quilt somewhat stiff, so it's going to change the hand of it. But that is what a lot of painters use as the top coat on top of their paintings to make that paint protected. Excuse me. Protected. So that's an option too for your quilts. But really it's just being smart and keeping them out of the sun and keeping them clean. And your vacuum, a little handheld vacuum, is your best bet when it comes to keeping an art quilt clean.
Perfect. Okay, we've got a lot of long string questions that are just coming in, so we're going to work our way through those. And again, we're answering questions for the next, the next hour for the most part. So if you want to get your questions in, go ahead and enter them in the comment box underneath this video, and we're going to keep working through questions. So Stacy asks, what would you recommend to secure your quilt when sandwiched with safety pins? You use a hand base, a tack gun. How do you hold your quilt layers together?
Well, I hold my quilt layers together with straight pins, and there are more and more people doing this all the time. I've been doing it for about 10 years. I use silk pins that have a tiny little metal head, not the ones with a glass head, and they need to be silk pins. And you can buy pins that call themselves silk pins at the cheaper stores, but they're not. If the pin is not long and very thin, it's probably not a good silk pin. There are two brands that I recommend. One is called Iris, I-R-I-S, and the other is called IBC. And either of those in the version that has just the tiny metal head is what I use. So what I do is I pin baste with those straight pins the area I'm going to quilt first, and then put some big safety pins around the outside edge just to hold the 3 layers together. Then I quilt the area that I have pinned, re-smooth, pin the area I'm going to quilt next, and quilt that area. In the beginning, you're going to poke yourself a little bit here and there with those straight pins, but after a while you get used to them and you stop poking yourself with them. And to me it's the best way because I can stitch right over those pins, and I never break my machine needle when I do that. Occasionally I'll break a pin because I hit it with the needle, but the needle's about twice the size as the pin, and so it's the pin that breaks, not the needle, and I don't have to worry about knocking out the timing on my machine by breaking a needle. So this is the way I baste, and it's been working for me for a very long time, and it allows me to get pins really close together if I need them to be, or I can put them farther apart if I know I've got a really smooth top.
Perfect. Now our next question that just came in has to do with iron, so I'm going to remind everyone again, if you don't know already, that we're doing a giveaway. We're giving away an Aliso Smart Iron to one lucky National Quilter Circle fan, and you can enter to win that by clicking on the banner below the video on this page. So speaking of irons, Deborah wants to know, do you press with steam as you piece? I feel I press too much and am distorting my pieces somewhat.
Well, I guess it depends on whether or not she's actually pressing. Sorry, that's my cat. If she's actually pressing or if she's ironing. When you iron, you move the iron back and forth on the surface of the quilt or the piecing. If you're pressing, you're lifting the iron up and then putting it back down on the seam, and then lifting it back up and putting it back down on the seam. If you're pressing, you're not going to distort. If you're ironing, you are going to distort. So it's more about your methodology than it is about whether or not you use steam. I use steam all the time because steam really helps set those seams and make things nice and flat for the quilting later. And that's important to me. But I'm also a very good presser. I make sure that I don't distort the fabric by pushing it with the iron. So as long as you're lifting that iron up and then setting it down on those open seams or those seams that you've pushed in one direction or the other, you should be fine whether you use steam or not. But I believe steam makes a much flatter seam.
Perfect. Okay. Our next question here is from Judy, and she says that she has some silk scarves from Israel and would like to know how you would go about using them to make a quilt.
silk scarves for a quilt. That's fine as long as you're going to back those pieces of silk if they're very, very thin. If they're, it depends on the type of silk, charmeuse versus a habitai silk or whatever. You want to back them with a very thin, permanent iron-on interfacing. And this should be a non-woven, meaning that it is doesn't have a grain to it. And the reason we want that non-woven is it'll keep those silks from doing any stretching or moving around during the piecing process. So go to your favorite fabric or quilt store and ask for a very thin, non-woven, iron-on interfacing, and use that to iron to the back of the silk prior to cutting, and it will be fabulous for quilting. I use silks all the time, and it just makes a wonderful quilt surface.
Perfect. All right, we're going to go back to one of our pre-submitted questions because I think this kind of ties in a little bit with what you were just talking about. But Carol wants to know if there's a right or wrong side to batting, and what's the difference between stabilizers and interfacings and things like that.
Okay. So about the batting, no, there's not a right or a wrong side. There isn't. At least none of the battings I've ever used. Certainly some look better on one side than the other. Make sure that you get the bulk of the wrinkles out of your batting before you use it, because sometimes you'll end up being able to see those wrinkles in your quilt when you're done. So either press your batting or mist it a little bit and throw it in the dryer to get those wrinkles out. But no, there's no right or wrong side. Now when it comes to interfacing versus stabilizer, well, they're both very, very similar. Interfacing, however, always stays in and is usually used for garments. Stabilizers can stay in the project or be taken off of the project after they've stabilized. So a lot of people use stabilizers when they're doing machine embroidery, machine applique, and thread painting, and then they pull off or take away any excess stabilizer after they're finished with the project of stitching before they've done the quilting. Whereas the interfacing is usually put in the lapels or the collars and things like that, or waistbands of clothing, and it stays in. So that's the basic difference between those two products.
All right, changing gears a little bit, we're going to go and talk a little bit about some piecing. So Susan says, usually I see instructions that increase by 1/2 inch when cutting your blocks to allow for a 1/4 inch seam. However, I've recently seen them being increased by 7/8 of an inch. When would you use a 7/8 inch when increasing your patterns for cutting pieces?
Wow, I'm not really sure. 7/8 inch is a really large seam allowance. I can't imagine using that in quilting. It would get in the way. Generally a 1/4 inch on either side of the piece, which is an additional 1/2 inch in the cutting, is plenty. It could be that the 7/8 inch is for something like using flannels or wool, because those things would need a heftier seam allowance. But other than that, I can't come up with any reason why a 7/8 inch would be better for your quilt than the 1/2 inch that we normally use.
All right. Our next question here, Janet asks, what is your feeling about using glue, such as an Elmer's purple washable, to hold your fabric together as you sew?
Glue to hold my fabric together as I sew. Well, I don't know that I would ever use glue to hold it together as I sew, unless you're talking about applique. And a lot of us will glue down applique pieces before we either hand stitch or machine stitch. I don't know that I would use glue to hold units together that I am piecing for a pieced quilt. I think that would kind of take too long, number one, and get in the way, number two. For applique, though, there's quite a few different glues out there. Some are permanent glues, and then some are water-soluble that are going to rinse out the first time you launder the quilt. The issue is a lot of people don't launder those quilts, and that glue stays in and eventually discolors. And years later, you can see little yellow spots on the quilt, and that yellowing is where that glue is inside. So if the glue that you're thinking about using doesn't tell you what to do with it after you've finished using it to hold things in place, if it doesn't say launder out, you might want to consider laundering that so that you don't end up with any yellowing later. Anytime we put any type of chemical or any type of product on the surface of our quilt, we're kind of, entering the Netherlands, if you will, because we're not sure how that's going to affect that quilt unless somebody else has already done it and has included that information in the how-to on the container of that product. I always err on the side of being extra safe. If I've never used a product before and I'm going to use it as a temporary bonding agent, then I'm going to launder it out afterwards. So, just because your best friend said, oh, I always use a glue stick when I do this, doesn't necessarily mean that's good for the quilt in the long run, especially if you don't tend to launder your quilts. If you throw your quilts in the washing machine the minute they're finished, then that probably isn't as big of an issue. But consider whether or not that glue or any other product is going to stay inside the quilt, and how you think that might affect the quilt's life. So certainly you can use glues that are made for fabrics to hold down units during applique, but I probably wouldn't use them for piecing. Some people do use them in paper piecing, and that's okay too. They'll hold down their first piece, and that's fine, again, as long as you're going to launder out that glue when you're done.
All right, speaking of just washing quilts, we've got a couple questions that have come in just now, as well as some that were submitted beforehand about pre-washing your fabric and whether or not you always do that. If you pre-wash, should you use starch? Can you wash large sections of fabric all at one time? What are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, laundering is such a big question, and it's pretty divisive when it comes to the whole quilting genre. There are people who definitely never wash and people who always wash, and there's a lot of arguing between the two. And I have to admit that I'm a washer, and I'm a washer for one very specific reason. I want to know what the fabric is going to behave like when it's laundered, because a lot of fabrics don't look nearly as good after they've been laundered as they look before they've been laundered. So I don't want to end up with a fabric in my quilt that wrinkles, shrinks, distorts, all those things that happen during laundering. I think it depends on how tough you are on your quilts. If you're making quilts that you're going to be doing a lot of using, you're going to be making lap quilts that kids are going to use, adults are going to use, picnic quilts, quilts that are going to be in the laundry a lot, I would always pre-launder. If I'm making mostly archival pieces, small applique pieces that are always going to be on the wall, well then maybe I wouldn't launder so much, but I would choose one side of the fence or the other so that everything is the same, because having to determine whether you've laundered a fabric or not when it comes out of your stash would be very tough. So either wash everything or don't wash everything. If you don't wash everything, you need to be doing a lot of testing. This means that any fabric that has any amount of color in it, you need to cut a snippet off and put it in some hot water and see if it changes the color of that water. If it does, it means that it's hypersaturated with dye or pigments, and that stuff is going to get all over the place the first time you launder that quilt. So I always say err on the side of being smart for my end result. Whatever I'm going to do with my quilts is what I'm going to do with my fabric. If I'm going to launder the heck out of my quilts, then I'm going to launder my fabric. So keep that in mind. Now when it comes to laundering big pieces of fabric, yeah, they get all tangled up in there and they can be a pain, but they need to be laundered too. So what I tend to do is fold them into a approximately yard by the width of the fabric size pieces. So if it's 5 yards, I'll fold it 5 times into a 1 yard by the width of the fabric piece and stitch through each of the corners by hand, just one big stitch through each corner by hand, so that all 5 yards are being held together, sort of. Then I throw it in the wash and then throw it in the dryer for about 15 minutes or so. Then I hang it to dry the rest of the way. And that way it doesn't get too wrinkled, everything kind of stays on grain, and it's very easy to then fold and put up in my stash and then iron as I need it.
Perfect. Now we're getting a lot of questions coming in, and we're going to keep working through those for about the next half hour or so. But I want to remind everyone that, we want you to connect with us now, but we also want you to continue to connect with us even after this live event on our website, on social media, Pinterest, Twitter, Facebook. We'd love to hear from you at any time. So we'll move right along with some more questions. And Sheila wants to know, what are your favorite embellishments for an art quilt to make it sing?
There's so many. Right now, metal. I just love metal. Old vintage iron, old things that are all rusty and dirty. anything that tells a story. And that's one of the things about embellishments, is that a lot of people will just throw a whole bunch of stuff on the surface of the quilt and not really think about what it's adding to the piece. So my trick or tip is to make sure that whatever I put on the surface of the quilt is adding to the story that's already being told. So as you're considering different embellishments, just make sure that you kind of set them down on the surface of the quilt and audition them, and make sure that they're not getting in the way of what you have already going on there. Make sure that they're adding to the beauty of the piece and not deleting from it, and make sure that the embellishments are not fighting with anything else on the surface. Other than that, pretty much anything goes. You can embellish with beads, with glass, with sea stones, pretty much anything you can think of. The biggest thing is, how is it going to get on that surface? Am I going to hand stitch it on? Am I going to glue it on? And if I glue it on, what type of glue am I going to use? There are some great books out there on embellishing. I wrote one, and there are lots and lots of wonderful videos. I've done hundreds of them, literally, for this site, so you can get all kinds of information about embellishing. But as for my favorite right now, I got to say it's metal.
Absolutely. We definitely do have tons and tons of videos that you've done with embellishing, and we even have one of your classes that should be coming out soon, and that was where you did a lot of embellishing with metal and talked about how to audition and place everything. So tons of great tips in that class.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here, Kim wants to know what a scant 1/4 inch is and why it would be used in piecing.
The scant 1/4 inch. I believe the scant 1/4 inch should be used by almost everybody. What that means is that if you're using a 1/4 inch foot on your machine, most people actually sew with a chunky 1/4 inch. They're being able to see the edge of their fabric to the right side of their 1/4 inch foot. So they're actually sewing with what I call a chunky 1/4 inch. The reason we want to use that scant 1/4 inch, which means that the fabric is going to ride just inside the edge of that foot rather than on the outside of the edge of that foot, is that because when we flip that fabric over, that flip takes up a little bit of fabric and will give us an accurate 1/4 inch if we've sewn it with a scant 1/4 inch. The problem is that if you go too scant, then all your units are going to be too big. So whatever you do, do it consistently. If you're always taking a chunky 1/4 inch, things are going to fit. If you're always taking a scant 1/4 inch, things are going to fit. If you're always taking a regular 1/4 inch, things are going to fit. Whatever you do, do it consistently so that your units all fit to each other.
Perfect. All right, our next question here, Stephanie asks, would you use a starching agent to stiffen pieces for intricate quilt designs?
When? Is that the question?
Yeah,
when do you use a starching?
Or if you were going to quilt intricate quilt designs, would you use one?
Myself, probably not, no. That would require me to launder again, and a lot of times I'm doing art quilting that I don't want to have to launder because of all sorts of other issues. If I was doing an intricate design and I thought starch would help, I would paper piece instead. So that would be my suggestion, would be to design a paper pieced unit for that area instead of starching. But I do know a lot of people use starch if they're doing something like a kaleidoscope or something like that. And so you can just make sure that you get that starch out afterwards, because it's hard to stitch through, whether it's hand or machine, later during the quilting process. So yeah, it's going to help you a bit. However, a starched fabric is also a slick fabric. So it kind of helps you in one area, but then brings about another issue in another area. You can give it a try, but I'm not sure it's always the best answer.
Okay. So we have a lot of questions that deal with quilting and machine quilting and hand quilting, and so we're going to kind of transition into some of those questions now. And so our first question comes from Jan. She wants to know, how much wider does backing and batting need to be before the top is added?
Well, machine, it depends on whether you're quilting on your home machine or a long arm. If you're quilting on a long arm, most long armers will agree that about 6 inches extra on all sides, which means 12 inches extra total. Whereas most people who quilt on their home machines are content with 2 to 3 inches extra on all sides, which is 4 to 6 inches in total. And that's what I do. I tend to have my batting at least 2 inches bigger than my top, and my backing at least 3 inches bigger than my top. And this helps when everything shifts around, or it also helps if I don't get things down there perfectly. So it gives me plenty of excess, and I've never had a problem with using on my home machine the 2 to 3 inches.
Perfect. All right, our next question came in, and it's from Susan, and she says she has a vertical quilting question. When doing vertical quilting, do you start out by stitching in the ditch, or where do you start so everything looks even?
Well, you know, this is a whole interesting thing, this stitching in the ditch first. Back in the day, about 20 years ago, everybody stitched in the ditch, and that's all they did. And then for a while, when we started doing more decorative quilting across the surface of our quilts, people still thought that they needed to stabilize the quilt by stitching in the ditch, and then they go back and do some additional quilting. Well, unfortunately, when you do that, you can end up with a lot of fullness where you don't want it and end up with some puckering. So now we recommend not stabilizing the quilt first with in the ditch quilting. When it comes to quilting, I'm assuming when you say vertical, you're talking about long lines of piecing, and then you're quilting in those long lines of piecing. So what I would simply do is choose a centermost row and quilt that row, and then quilt the rows on either side of it, and then quilt the rows on either side of that. So basically I'm starting near the middle and then quilting out in each direction. And I start at the top of that row. Now, some people would start in the middle of the row, quilt in one direction, go back to the middle of the row and quilt in the other direction. I don't necessarily want to have to do that. I want to start at the top and stitch down to the bottom. And because that's what I do, I put excess batting and backing at the bottom of the quilt. So more down there than I have on the top and on the two sides. So that as I quilt downwards, and if it pushes any fullness of the top or the batting down, then I'm still going to have enough batting and backing when I get down there. So that's the only change that I make on a long linear quilt, is that on the bottom I'm going to put a little bit more excess batting and backing so that I don't have an issue when I get down there.
Perfect. All right, I want to remind anyone who's maybe just tuning in, we have about a half hour left. If you want to ask your questions for Heather to answer, you can submit those in the comment section underneath this video, and we're going to continue working our way through questions. I also want to remind everyone that we're giving away an Aliso Smart Iron to one lucky National Quilter Circle fan, and you can enter to win the iron by clicking on the banner below the video on this page. All right, moving on to some more questions. Carolyn says, I love to do free motion on my regular machine, however I have trouble with thread breaking. I use cotton threads. Can you recommend a thread that may be stronger?
I really like this question, and it's going to sound like I'm giving you an obtuse answer, but the answer is a thread that your machine likes. And different machines actually prefer different threads, and this is because different brands of machines are calibrated in their process of being built to different brands of threads. If you're using a thread that consistently breaks and it's always the same brand, then that's probably your issue, and I would suggest switching to a different brand. However, if any thread that you throw in there consistently breaks, then it's probably not the thread at all, it's the size of your needle. One of the things that people don't understand sometimes is that you need to match the size of your needle to the size of your thread. So it's not just the style or type of needle that you're using that's important, it's also the size of that needle. So anytime my thread is breaking, this is the steps that I go through to get that thread to stop breaking, if I can. The very first thing I do is I rethread the top of my machine to make sure I didn't have it threaded in properly, and that's what caused the breakage. If it breaks again, then I change my needle size. Whatever size needle I'm using is probably too small, and I move up to a slightly larger needle. So if I was using a size 80 needle, I would move up to a 90. If I was using a 90, I would move up to 100. So I'm going to use a bigger needle. Now, if that doesn't fix it, then chances are my machine does not like that thread. And I can't really give you a brand of thread that your machine is going to like, but I can tell you some very good brands of thread, and I can tell you the brand of thread that I use the most. And I'm not saying that other threads aren't good, but there are some threads that I have never liked on any of my machines. The threads that I tend to use the most are Aurifil, and that's spelled Aurifil. I really like those threads. However, some people do a lot of jostling with their machine and break those threads a lot, and so they don't like them. But there are other threads such as Gutermann, which is a good quality thread. There are threads that are sold at quilt stores, and then there are threads that are sold at big box stores, and then there are threads that are sold at both. You're always going to be headed in the right direction when you buy a thread from a quilt store. Thread is a huge investment for a store to buy. You have to buy a lot of it when you decide you're going to sell that brand. And so those quilt stores have done due diligence and found high quality good threads to sell, whereas the big box stores are trying to give you your best bang for your buck. And so they're probably selling you lower end threads rather than higher end threads. That being said, if you've purchased a thread at your quilt store and then see it at the big box store, you can buy it at that big box store too. They've probably decided that they need to carry some higher end threads for people who are more discerning, like you've become. So if you're buying from your quilt store, chances are it's a good quality thread. And if you're having problems breaking it, either that needle is too small, you've misthreaded it, or it's just a thread that your machine doesn't like and you're going to have to try another brand. I hope that helps.
Well, we've got more thread questions coming up too. So that was thread breaking. Now Suzanne wants to know, what is the cause of the eyelashes on the back of a quilt during free motion quilting?
That's a tension issue. That's something wrong with your tension. And if it's happening on the back of your quilt, then it means that your bobbin tension is probably a little too tight. And unfortunately, so many of today's machines are entirely computerized and don't let you change that tension in there. And so what you have to do is adjust your top tension accordingly. So my first thing would be to make sure that you've got everything threaded properly. So I rethread the bobbin and I rethread the top. If it's still happening, then I start to loosen my top tension a bit. And when I say a bit, I mean by a quarter of a number. If my tension is set on 5 and I can reduce it to 4 7/8 or 4 3/4, that's what I'm going to do. Tiny, tiny little bits in your reduction. Most people tend to just go crazy and change it by a whole number, and that's not necessary. Generally speaking, it's just a little tiny bit. After you've played with this quite a while, you can get kind of frustrated, and if it's still eyelashing, then I'm going to say change threads, check your needle, make sure it hasn't got anything wrong with it, perhaps put a new needle in. When it comes down to it, if it keeps doing it no matter what needle or what thread, it could be an issue with the timing of your machine. So hopefully it's just a tension issue, and you can play with that adjusting of your tension by tiny little increments until it stitches well.
Absolutely, and when I'm doing anything with tension, I like to write down whatever I did change-wise so I can always take it back.
Good idea. Yep.
Our next question here comes from Marcy, and she says she's a brand new quilter, and when talking about free motion quilting, everybody says to be careful not to cross over your stitches. Why is that, and how important is it to not cross over your previous stitches?
Well, that's only in some designs. In other designs, you have to cross over your stitches. So if you're talking about stippling or meandering, yes, we don't want to cross over our stitches when we stipple or meander. Is the world going to come to an end if we do? No. Chances are you're never going to see it again once you've done it a couple of times. But it depends on the design. So we have, literally hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of different designs for machine quilting, and lots of them not only require you to cross over your stitching, but require you to double over your stitching that you've already done. So again, if you're talking about stippling or meandering, that's that little curvy line that just kind of wanders all over the surface of the quilt and fills in the space. Yeah, ideally we don't want that to cross over, those lines to cross over, because what happens then is it forms a shape, a circle or an oblique or a oblong shape of some sort. And the magic of the stipple or the meander is that it doesn't form a shape, and that's why it works so well in so many areas of a quilt, is because no additional shapes are being formed. It's simply a wandering line, and it doesn't impede the design that's already on the surface from the piecing and the fabric. But is it going to be the end of the world if you occasionally do when you first start out? No, it's not going to be the end of the world. It just means you occasionally crossed over, and I challenge you to find those crossovers later when you're finished with the whole thing. So just relax, enjoy the process, practice it so that you get better. Just practice and practice. It's the only thing that's going to make you better as a machine quilter. And don't take yourself or the process too seriously.
All right, our next comment that came in, I actually want to sort of go back to the previous question where we're talking about seam allowances and that 7/8 of an inch. I think I misunderstood the original question, but the 7/8 inch would be what you would add to a square if you're going to make a half square triangle. Would that be where 7/8? Okay, so if you can kind of explain what that means.
That could very well be what she was doing. So if you're doing half square triangles or quarter square triangles, you add a 7/8 of an inch if you're doing the half square triangles, because you're going to be cutting twice. And basically, if you add a whole inch, if for some reason it just makes it too big. Adding that 7/8 inch is magic for that. And if you're doing the quarter square triangles, then you add that 1.25 inches. So yeah, that's a whole different ball game to regular cutting. The regular cutting, when everything's a square or a rectangle, or a line, a long strip, is always going to be that 1/2 inch. But yes, there are lots of different little tricks that we do in cutting for those piecing of quarter inch or quarter square triangles or half square triangles, and that's where that 7/8 would come in.
Awesome. Well, thank you for clearing that up, and thank you, Liz, for bringing that to our attention. And I apologize I got that wrong on the first question there. Our next question here, it says, I quilted a table runner, but found that I quilted too far apart in one spot. Therefore, the fabric is bunched. Do I tear it out and re-quilt?
Well, not seeing the table runner, I can't really give you an absolute answer, but I can make some suggestions for you. So the first thing is in that area that's bunched, if you can take your fingers in there and smooth the bunching out and get it to lay relatively flat, then you don't have to take the stitching out. You can simply put a lot of straight pins in there, silk pins preferably, and then go back in and very, very carefully quilt that area. If you can't make it lay flat, though, you're going to have to remove the stitching around that area if you don't want it to be poofy there. Unfortunately, one of a million different things could have happened to make that happen. The basting wasn't adequate. The top is too big in that area. The piecing is inaccurate. You had some fabric stretching. You quilted into that area, meaning that you pushed excess fabric into that area instead of quilting away from that area, which would push excess fabric away from that area. So all sorts of things could have happened. But at this point, if you can make it lay flat, and not with the iron, but with your fingers, if you can simply move that fabric by stretching things just ever so slightly, the bottom layers, all the layers, and pin it and make it lay flat, then you can quilt it flat. If you can't make it lay flat through stretching and pinning, then you're going to have to remove all that quilting, which isn't a lot of fun.
It's never fun to unsew or unquilt anything.
No.
So we still have a few more minutes, so if you have any more questions that you want to ask, feel free to submit those in the comment section under this video. Also, below the video, you'll see you can enter to win an Oliso Smart Iron. We're giving one of those away to a lucky fan. So be sure to enter by clicking the banner below the video on this page. All right, moving on to our next question here. It's from Pamela. And she says, what is the best way to learn machine quilting that will make machine quilting easier for beginning machine quilters?
The best way to learn to machine quilt to make it easier for beginner machine quilters is to relax. Relax, relax, relax. We take it all so seriously. So, first of all, make sure that you have a very comfortable chair. that you can pull that chair very close into your machine, that you can pull your machine very close to the edge of the table and snuggle up to that machine. Make sure that you are up above the machine, that the chair is high enough that you can look down at the needle as it enters into the surface of the quilt. If you're looking across at the needle, then you're too low and your body's going to hurt. And as soon as you start to hurt, you're going to get more frustrated, and then you're not going to like the process. So high above the machine, look down at the needle, close to the machine, machine close to you is kind of where you want to be. Once you get there, then you simply want to remember and remind yourself, I'm dancing with my machine. Put some music on, have a glass of wine, whatever it is you need to do to relax, and play. So if you're going to be playing, we're not going to be doing this on the quilt that we think is going to be our magnum opus. We're going to do it on practice quilts. We're going to do it on quilts that we're giving away to teenagers that are going to annihilate those quilts, or babies that are going to barf on those quilts. We want to do a lot of practicing on quilts that quote-unquote aren't important, that are just for people to use up. And then we're not so caught up in our ego in how fabulous that quilting is. Unfortunately, machine quilting is becoming the most amazing art, and people are doing things in machine quilting that we never thought we could do. But when we're beginning, and we need to go easy on ourselves, and we just need to have some fun. Learn some basic skills. Remember that as you move, so moves the thread on across the surface of your quilt. So get used to moving the way you want that thread to move, and that's that dancing portion. Relax. Relax, relax, and enjoy the process. We've got some great videos here. I've done quite a few videos on machine quilting, and it takes practice. Taking a whole bunch of classes isn't going to help you after you've got that basic information. Practicing is going to help you after you've got that basic information.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here is from Diane, and she says, do you ever use invisible thread to quilt your top?
I don't. I know a lot of people who do. I don't, because I've never had a machine that liked invisible thread, and I would fight with it all the time, number one. And number two, I don't like the way it looks. And number three, if I heat it, it melts. And number four, if there's loose threads, they poke and scratch. So it's never really been the answer for me. I love the way the thread looks on the surface of the quilt also. I like the way the color of the thread augments the surface of the quilt. So clear thread has never been something that attracted me. However, if you want to use that clear thread, there's no reason why you can't. Make sure that it's a very high quality clear thread though. Purchase it only at quilt stores. Make sure that when you use it, it unwinds off of the spool just like a regular thread does, and it's soft and malleable. If when it comes off the spool it's stiff and it comes off in lines rather than soft curls, that is not the invisible thread to use on a quilt.
All right, we have a couple questions here that have to do with batting. One wants to know what you think the best kind of batting is, and one is what is specifically the best batting for children's quilts. If you can kind of answer them both at the same time.
Okay. The best batting for children's quilts is any batting that isn't polyester. The best batting that I like to use is any batting that isn't polyester. That being said, I certainly have favorites, but it's such a broad question because I have to ask the question back in return, is batting for what? There's lots of different types of battings that work better for different end types of quilts. But when it comes to children's quilts, there is a wonderful batting out called Eco batting, ECCO batting, and it is made from corn. And it acts and behaves like polyester. It's got that nice poof to it, so it's great. It feels all soft and comfy even before it's been laundered. But it's made out of corn, and you can get it in 100% of the corn product or 50% of the corn product and 50% cotton, which is my favorite. It's not as poofy, but I just like it better. The reason why this batting is so wonderful is because if it catches fire, it turns into water vapor and puts itself out. So if you love a kid that you're giving a quilt to, what a fabulous thing to put in there. You're actually going to protect their safety. Whereas any batting that has more than 60% polyester, that batting is going to melt in a fire. That batting is going to melt when it gets too hot. And that melting can cause a lot of damage to anybody who's near that quilt. And there are fabrics that are made out of polyester that people are using in their quilts that will do the same thing. So I highly suggest not using those things for baby quilts or children's quilts. Instead, I would use that wonderful Eco batting. ECCO is the brand, and or the name, Eco batting. And if you can't find that, then I would stick with, if I want a poofy quilt, I would use wool. And if I don't want a poofy quilt, I would stick with one of the wonderful cottons. My favorite cottons are cottons that are blends. I like cottons that are blended with bamboo, cottons that are blended with bamboo and silk, cottons that are blended with just silk, cottons that are blended with wool. The reason I like those is cottons are strong, and those other products can be warmer. Wool and silk are warmer than cotton, or they can be poofier. The wool is poofier than silk, than cotton, so if I want something that is going to show off my quilting, I'll include something that has wool in it. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. All right, we have a question here, and they want to know if they can sell a quilt made by someone else's pattern if they name them as the designer in the label.
Well, copyright is a very, very slippery slope, and my first answer would be yes, if you only do it once. If you want to do it more than once, you need to contact that designer and ask for her permission. And that's called licensing. If you want to use her design and sell it over and over again, then you need to get a licensing agreement with that designer. Now, if you don't, are you breaking the law? Yes, you are. If she finds out that you're doing this, she can actually sue you. Is it likely to happen? No, because that costs a lot of money to sue you. But it makes you kind of a jerk if you don't. So don't be a jerk. If you want to sell it once, you could do that without permission, but I would still suggest getting permission. This is somebody's intellectual property that she's letting you use for the price that you paid for the pattern. You do not own that intellectual property. You simply own the paper the pattern was written on. You paid for the privilege of using that pattern. You did not pay for the privilege of making money off of that design. That is her right because she designed it. And we need to all be very, very careful with our sisters in quilting out there and our brothers who are out there designing. It's hard work designing new pieces. It's hard work writing patterns. And we need to honor that. And we need to understand that when we pay the price for that pattern, we're paying for the use of making that pattern for ourselves. We're not paying for the right to make money off of that pattern. So be upstanding as an individual, contact that designer and ask for permission. 99.9% of the time they're going to say, yes, please, just make sure my name's on there too. Every once in a while you run across somebody who's tighter, but most of us are happy for you to use our things, but we want to know that you're doing it so that we have a little bit of a modicum of control of what's happening out there with our intellectual property.
Absolutely, yes. So we're coming up on the end of the hour, and there's a few things I want to remind everybody of before we end. One is that we are giving away that Aliso Smart Iron, and you can still enter to win that by clicking on the banner below the video on this page. And then just reminding everybody that we want you to keep continuing to join us for these live events every month, but connect with us anytime on the website, on social media, Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, all sorts of things. We'd love to hear your questions at any time. And we have a good question to end with, and that is a question for you, Heather. Will you create more art quilts?
This was a really interesting question, so I have to assume that whoever asked this question either knows me or has been hearing things about what's going on in my life. And I have to be honest with everybody out there. Right now, I'm not doing much sewing. Right now, I'm making jewelry. However, I know that I will always consider myself an art quilter, and I know that I will eventually get back to art quilting, and am looking for ways of pulling the two things together, which is probably why I'm working with metals so much, is I love the metal on the surface of fabric. So the answer is right now, no, I'm not doing a whole lot of sewing, but I know that there are probably hundreds of art quilts in my future. So yeah, I'll always be an art quilter.
Well, just a follow up then, is it near future or far future where these art quilts are going to come back in?
I don't know. I don't know.
All right,
Right
well,
now,
everyone.
I'm having so much fun making jewelry that I can't. There's no time for anything else. So
Well, everyone's going to have to stay tuned, not only to keep coming back and getting advice and tips and everything from Heather, but to also see when her next quilts are going to be out there for us to see and enjoy. So we're all looking forward to whatever you create next. In the meantime, we'll love all the jewelry you're making. I want to thank you so much again for being here to answer all these questions. And thank you to everybody
thanks
who
for.
submitted questions live during the hour beforehand. We really appreciate you all. Again, Heather, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a good night.